Where are you watching from? Let's know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting stories. The night was humid on the Florida coast, the kind of heat that clung to the skin and made the air itself feel heavy. Searchlights swept across black water as unmarked boats pulled toward a private island. Federal agents, dressed in tactical gear, whispered orders into radios. The world's richest man, or perhaps its most elusive criminal, was supposed to be here. At least, that was the hope. When the raid began, it was precise and violent. Helicopters rattled palm trees. Doors were rammed open. Vaults were blown with thermal drills. Every second felt like it was about to uncover the secret empire of Marcus Hale. But inside those steel rooms, there was nothing. No gold, no diamonds, no secret servers. Just emptiness, as though someone had erased the island before they arrived. A single question echoed through the investigators' minds. How does a man worth billions vanish without leaving a trace? And why, in the months leading up to the raid, did people close to him keep disappearing one by one? To the outside world, Marcus Hale was a storybook billionaire. A tech genius who founded Hale Systems, a cybersecurity empire that once protected governments, banks, and even the Pentagon. His face appeared on magazine covers. His donations built hospitals and schools. He spoke of transparency, digital freedom, and global equality. Yet behind the polished speeches, whispers followed him like shadows. They spoke of bribes, offshore vaults, and secret meetings in the dead of night. The first to vanish wasn't Marcus himself. It was Daniel Reeve, his accountant. Daniel had been with Hale from the early days, when the company was just a two-room office packed with servers. He was meticulous, quiet, the kind of man who noticed numbers didn't lie even when people did. One spring afternoon, while reconciling transactions across dozens of accounts, he stumbled onto something that chilled him. The ledgers led nowhere. Money flowed out of Hale's charitable foundations in neat, steady amounts, but the destinations were all paper entities, addresses in Panama, shell NGOs in the Cayman Islands, silent trusts in Luxembourg. Billions weren't being donated, they were being buried. Daniel tried to raise questions discreetly. He left notes with his legal advisor, reached out to a journalist he trusted. But 3 nights later, his car was found abandoned on a bridge overlooking the Potomac River. The police report called it suicide. Yet no body surfaced. His family insisted he would never take his own life. And within days, every hard drive in his home was wiped clean. Marcus Hale expressed sorrow in public. He paid for memorial services, shed practice tears, and promised donations in Daniel's name. Behind the cameras, silence spread. No employee dared mention Daniel's discovery again. It was as if he had been erased from the company's history. But the whispers grew louder. A few journalists dug deeper. One in particular, Emily Vargas, a sharp investigative reporter known for exposing corruption, began tracing the so-called charities Hale had funded. She discovered that funds pledged for children's hospitals in West Africa never arrived. Instead, the same amounts circled back through layers of anonymous companies and landed in investment funds Hale himself controlled. She prepared an exposé, charts, emails, testimony from insiders. It was supposed to run on a Monday morning. On Sunday night, Emily's apartment caught fire. Neighbors pulled her out just in time. She survived, but when asked about her story afterward, she refused to speak. She sold her notes to an unknown buyer and left journalism entirely. Some said she had been paid off. Others believed she had been threatened. Either way, her silence became another stone in the wall surrounding Marcus Hale. Still, Marcus appeared untouchable. His public image only grew brighter. Glossy magazines declared him a modern Rockefeller. Presidents praised his philanthropy. Universities begged him to endow departments in his name. And yet, on the fringes, a darker picture was emerging, one of a man constructing not just a company but a fortress. He purchased an island in the Caribbean, a jewel of turquoise water and white sand. But unlike the resorts nearby, this island was walled with steel fences, cameras, and motion sensors. Guests who visited spoke of luxury beyond imagination, gourmet feasts, private concerts, staff that anticipated every need. but some insiders whispered that it felt more like a gilded prison. Entry required biometric scans. Entire wings were off-limits. Drones patrolled the skies at night. Rumors spread of who visited. Politicians, foreign ministers, energy tycoons, even alleged crime bosses, all ferried in under cover of night, leaving before dawn. Photos leaked online showed strange shipments arriving on the docks. Unmarked crates transferred with military precision. Theories multiplied. Was Hale smuggling? Laundering? Or building something far worse? Then came the satellite images. Amateur analysts comparing aerial shots noticed something strange. Just beyond the primary island, partially hidden by thick mangroves and black rock, stood a second facility. Smaller, heavily shielded, with strange heat signatures suggesting underground chambers. It wasn't on any registry. It wasn't listed on any property deed. But it was there. And when one drone operator tried to fly closer, his feed cut off mid-air, as though the signal had been jammed. The FBI took notice. International regulators began whispering about Hale's offshore empire. Interpol flagged transfers linked to him, but each lead seemed to evaporate before evidence could be gathered. Witnesses went silent. Servers went offline. Every trail ended in smoke. One investigator, desperate for answers, described it best. It was like chasing a ghost with unlimited money. And yet, in the middle of this tightening noose, Hale continued smiling on magazine covers. He attended galas. He cut ribbons at children's wards. He posed with presidents. To the world, he was an icon. But in the shadows, men and women who tried to touch his empire vanished. Some into silence, some into graves. The world asked, who was Marcus Hale really? A genius billionaire, or something far more dangerous? And then a break appeared. A woman named Claire Morneau, a mid-level accountant working inside one of Hale's Luxembourg holding companies, managed to smuggle out a flash drive. She didn't go to the press. She didn't call the police. She slipped the device to a trusted colleague with only one instruction. If anything happens to me, release this. What was on that drive would change everything. But at the time, no one knew. Because within 48 hours, Claire was dead. Official cause, natural heart failure. She was 34 years old. Under a gray Luxembourg sky, the building that held Hale's quietest secrets looked like any other glass cube on a business park ring road, clean, reflective, unremarkable. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed above rows of desks where accountants coded money like monks copying scripture. Claire Morneau had worked at Desk 42 for 3 years and never once drew attention. She wore muted colors, ate the same salad, and smiled politely when her supervisor walked by. For months she had watched transfers arriving in precise, modest drips. 50,000 here, 200,000 there, never enough to raise flags, always enough to matter. She noticed that each transfer split, then split again, branching through trusts named after lesser-known constellations. Indus, Dorado, Vela, until the origin was untraceable. She began making a map. Then she put that map, and the ledgers behind it, onto a flash drive the size of her thumbnail. 2 days later, she died in her sleep and never woke up. The colleague she had trusted, a thin, careful man who insisted on being called simply R, waited 48 hours as instructed. Then he boarded a train to Paris with the flash drive inside a packet of chewing gum. He sat at a cafe on Boulevard Saint-Germain and ordered black coffee he didn't drink. A woman approached, early 40s, a faded denim jacket, a camera bag slung across her chest. She sat without greeting him and slid a folded newspaper across the table. R tucked the gum packet inside, stood, and left. The woman, an independent researcher who occasionally fed tips to investigative journalists, counted to 100, paid for his coffee, and walked into the rain. That evening, she opened the drive in a motel on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where the night clerk didn't look up. The folder structure was simple: shadow underscrust, ledgers, correspondence, a small cache of audio files labeled by date, and a single initial "hm." She clicked a ledger first. The numbers were precise and cold. Each line item moved through 2 or 3 custodians in different countries within minutes, burying itself within passive index funds that held tiny positions in thousands of companies. It was genius in its banality. If anyone tried to follow the money, they would be staring at normalcy, retirement funds, municipal bonds, sleepy ETFs, never realizing a fraction of each was siphoned by skimming algorithms toward companies Hale controlled off-book. That invisible stream, less than 0.1% at every stop, fed an ocean. Claire's estimate, if her calculations were right, was staggering, more than $50 billion under silent control. The researcher's hands trembled. She opened a second folder. Correspondence, sanitized but still human. Ensure the minister receives the scholarship endowment memo by Friday. Delay procurement parcel until audit concludes. Rotate security teams in Q3, do not reuse ports. That last sentence made her look up. Ports? She scrolled. Buried in the monotony was a recurring tag, Inal port. The same 3 letters appeared alongside invoices for maritime maintenance, sensor calibration, submersible drones. She felt a chill. Vinal. She recognized it from fringe forums where satellite hobbyists traded images. Vinales, a rocky outcrop within the Caribbean, a whisper of a second island half hidden behind mangroves and volcanic stone. Public maps showed nothing, but amateurs said you could see a rectangle there, like the tip of a bunker. She clicked an audio file. A man's voice, warm, confident, the measured cadence of someone used to being listened to. Money is a signal, the voice said. When you move too much, the signal gets loud. People hear it. They follow it. So you move it like breath. Small, constant, barely audible. By the time someone notices, they've been breathing your air for years. She paused, replayed, listened for artifacts. It wasn't a deep fake. There were minute imperfections. The scratch of paper, a chair leg shifting. Marcus Hale had recorded that sentence in a real room, with real walls and a real microphone, and the certainty in his tone made her feel small. She copied the audio to a secure device and powered everything down. In the morning, she would share it with a reporter she trusted. She left the motel before dawn. Across the ocean, the FBI team assigned to Hale stared at a whiteboard that looked like a constellation someone had tried to erase with a dirty rag. Names circled and crossed out. Companies layered like geological strata. The agent in charge, a compact man with a martial haircut and a habit of speaking in short bursts, drew a square around 3 items on the board: Shadow Trust, Vinal Port, and a single name that had appeared in Claire's correspondence more than 40 times, Elias Cade. Nobody could agree on who he was. Some dossiers described him as a logistics consultant. Others called him a contingency manager. Rumors inside Hale's world used a simpler title, the cleaner. When a server needed to vanish, a witness needed to recant, or a transfer needed to look like an accident, Cade was the man in the room whose face you didn't remember. They started with the tangible. Claire's maps were translated into an interactive model. They fed the model market data and watched it light up like a night city scene from space. Microscopic schemes here, unrecorded fees there, all pulling toward a silent gravity well of companies that didn't technically exist. The model spat out nodes. If they could seize any one of a dozen intermediary custodians for questioning, maybe the structure would wobble. But subpoenas leaked. Every time they moved, someone moved faster. A server would go offline 20 minutes before a warrant arrived. A custodian would be on vacation with no forwarding address. Phone numbers would expire. It was a choreography of absence. The agent in charge made a decision he didn't write down. He pulled in a small off-book unit, a forensic banker who had built anti-money laundering systems for Swiss lenders, a former signals analyst who could reconstruct a network from noise, and a woman who used to run physical security for a private firm protecting diplomats in unstable capitals. They worked in a rented space above a printing shop where the machines downstairs provided cover noise. They ate at odd hours and rarely went home. The banker, an elegant woman whose suits never wrinkled, spent nights arguing with the data model like it was a person. The analyst rebuilt shredded routes and invented insults for whoever designed them. The security lead traced personnel movements, drivers, dock workers, subcontractors, anyone who might leave a footprint. 3 weeks in, she found one. A supply ship filed routine reports every month for Hale's Island. Fuel, dry goods, routine maintenance tools. The manifest never listed replacement drone rotors. But a dock camera from a neighboring resort had caught 2 crates labeled with a German manufacturer known for military-grade UAV parts being transferred under tarps to Hale's pier at 3:12 a.m., 3 months earlier. The crate's serial numbers matched a batch sold to a research institute in the Azores that had no staff. The ship's captain had signed nothing. Someone else had. The signature, when enhanced, curved into a neat K. The unit circled Cade on the whiteboard in a darker pen. The researcher in Paris delivered the audio file that same day to the journalist she trusted. The journalist was older now, careful, a veteran of too many close calls. She and the researcher sat at a kitchen table with their phones in the freezer. The journalist listened to Hale talk about money as breath, then pressed pause and looked out the window at a balcony where geraniums bloomed. She said, very softly, "We can't publish this tomorrow." The researcher looked ready to protest. The journalist explained, "If we publish now, they will close doors we don't even know exist yet. We need something physical, something they can't erase." The researcher exhaled and nodded. She slid a second item across the table, a scrap of paper with coordinates for a maintenance hatch, photographed from an engineering schematic tucked deep inside Claire's files. The Vienna port existed. This was an entrance. They reached out to a stringer in Havana who knew the currents better than any map and didn't scare easily. The stringer rented a cheap fishing boat, hired 2 brothers with calloused hands, and studied the weather like superstition. They sailed at dusk, then cut the engine and drifted. At midnight, the water around them grew colder and the air smelled faintly of metal. The stringer slipped over the side with a rebreather and a line clipped to his belt. He moved like a shadow and counted heartbeats. He found it 20 minutes later, a concrete lip under the mangroves, invisible unless you knew where to look. A hatch with a rubber seal, dark and quiet. He pressed a palm against it. It was warm. He planted a thumb-sized camera on a rock opposite, motion activated, battery life measured by the night, and returned to the surface where the boat swayed like a heartbeat. He slept with his cheek on the wooden bench. At dawn, the camera pinged his phone. Movement detected. The footage was short. The hatch opened inward. 2 men in gray coveralls slid a long black crate onto a dolly and pushed it into darkness. On the crate, stenciled in small letters, was a brand used by companies that preferred not to be known. The lid had a warning label, lithium battery hazard. The men wore identical shoes and the same short haircuts. They moved with the quiet competence of people who had done this exact motion many times before. The hatch closed. The rock opposite returned to being a rock. The stringer sent the footage to Paris. The journalist watched it twice, then called a contact at an international consortium that specialized in stories exactly like this, stories that crossed borders and banked secrecy like smugglers. Within hours, encrypted chat rooms filled with clipped sentences and images. A coder in Berlin enhanced the low-light footage. A legal team in London drew up a list of what could be said without forcing a judge's hand. A radio producer in New York mapped the story's cadence for a podcast episode that could double as a documentary script. The consortium decided on a date 3 weeks out. They would publish simultaneously everywhere. If Hale tried to silence one, another would speak. If he threatened one, he'd be threatening all. He didn't wait 3 weeks. 2 nights later, the Paris researcher felt a tremor rather than heard it. A low vibration through the floorboards of her apartment as if a truck had driven into the building. The lights flickered. She smelled smoke. She grabbed the laptop with the drive copy by instinct, wrapped it in a towel, and shoved it into her freezer. Then she opened her door to a stairwell filling with gray. By the time the fire brigade carried her into the street, her hands were black with soot and her hair smelled like burned plastic. A man in a dark coat watched from across the boulevard and touched his ear as if adjusting a hearing aid. When she tried to point him out, he was already gone. The next afternoon, the forensic banker from the off-book unit landed in Nassau under an alias to check on a custodian flagged by the model. The office was perfectly bland. Laminate desks, motivational posters, a receptionist who smelled of citrus. She asked to see the head of compliance, who smiled and said, "Of course. 1 moment, please." 15 minutes later, A man who introduced himself as Mr. Caden, pronounced to rhyme with maiden, shook her hand. He had a polite tan and eyes that belonged in a different climate. He offered her espresso and asked how he could help. She declined coffee. He sighed almost imperceptibly and said, "I do hope this is routine. We're all so busy, aren't we?" She noticed the ring finger of his right hand bore a thin groove where a ring had recently been removed. They talked in circles for 28 minutes. He gave her nothing, but the nothing came wrapped in charm. When she left, she wrote one sentence in her notebook and underlined it twice. Cade uses his real face. In a safe house outside Miami, the former signals analyst wired a wall with screens and built a mosaic of Cs. He scraped AIS pings from ships that had turned off their transponders near Hale's primary island. He calculated the statistical unlikelihood of how many temporary malfunctions occurred within a 20-mile radius of Vinales coordinates. He cross-referenced wind patterns, cloud cover, and sat imagery outages. The pattern, once it emerged, made the room feel colder, bursts of blackness in the data exactly when something heavy likely moved through the water at night. They needed a warrant for the island no one admitted existed. They wouldn't get one without a smoking gun. The journalists' consortium could be that gun, but the trigger would also alert Hale. The agent in charge faced a choice he could not discuss with anyone outside the small room above the printing shop. He decided to push both at once, build a case so airtight it would survive even if half of it leaked, and prepare for the moment the leak came anyway. They used a strategy stolen from chess: overload. The forensic banker filed a series of targeted suspicious activity reports in 3 jurisdictions within an hour of each other, naming identical nodes linked to Hale's funds. The analyst sent an anonymized packet of the drone hatch footage to a maritime safety board, which would, by law, share it with other agencies. The security lead quietly paid a visit to a dock worker from the neighboring resort whose brother owed money in a card game. The worker's memory improved with kindness. He remembered the exact nights the unmarked crates arrived. He even remembered a joke one of the men made about charging a heart that he didn't understand. The security lead wrote the line down and felt something click. Lithium battery hazard. Charging. Not drones. Not only drones. Backup power. Underwater. The journalist consortium set their clocks. In the final week before publication, a private plane landed in Antigua and taxied to a hangar without windows. 2 people descended. One was the man with polite tan. The other was taller, shoulders relaxed in the way of men who believe rooms accommodate them. They shook hands without smiling. Inside the hangar, a table had been set with bottled water and a folder thick with paper. The tan man opened it and read while the taller man watched a small screen showing a map pulsing with tiny lights, a digital ocean full of signals. The tan man scraped his thumbnail along the folder's spine and said, "They have the hatch." The taller man asked, "Do they have the vault?" The tan man shook his head. "No, not yet." The taller man nodded once and said, "Then we are where we always are, 1 hour ahead." The hour he spoke of arrived on a Wednesday. At 6:02 p.m. Universal Time Coordinated, a burst of stories published across the world. Headlines spoke of a billionaire's shadow fortune. Photographs of mangroves framed a rectangle of darkness. The audio file where Hale treated money like breath played over segments on evening radio. Podcasts pushed emergency episodes. The footage of the hatch cracked opened the internet's attention. Bloggers who hated each other for sport shared the same link. A lawmaker in Brussels demanded hearings. A pundit in New York shouted about the deep state. Hale's public relations firm issued a gentle eye roll of a statement calling the reports creative fiction. That night, the off-book unit's rented room filled with the underside of momentum. Tip lines sparked and burned. A woman emailed from Geneva claiming her fund had seen irregular rounding errors in accounts touching Hale's vehicles. A man texted from a prepaid phone in Boca Chica with rough coordinates for a bunker he swore he'd poured concrete for. Most tips were noise. But one message, forwarded from an old address no one had used in years, contained a single sentence: "You're still looking in the wrong place. The vault is not on land." The signals analyst sat up. He replayed satellite passes over Vinales and widened the circle. He asked the model a new question. If you wanted to store something sensitive, servers, documents, bullion, art, somewhere satellites rarely see and weather conveniently hides, where would you put it? The model drew a thin line from the hatch to a topographic shelf 40 meters below the surface, a depression where cold currents pooled and metal would cool quickly. A seafloor cave. The security lead put her hands on the table and said, "He put a vault under the water." The forensic banker leaned back and let out a sound that was not quite a laugh. Of course he did. They worked until dawn, building a shape from rumors. They found a supplier in Trieste who had once pitched submerged climate-controlled storage to a sovereign wealth fund as a novelty. The pitch had gone nowhere, but a company with an empty website and a fake board had purchased patents linked to that technology 2 years later. The company sat under a trust named Industry. Claire's map had a star next to Indus. Hale, always smiling on magazine covers, always cutting ribbons, had built a library for his secrets at the bottom of the sea. When the FBI finally filed for warrants, the documents were thicker than confessionals. The room above the printing shop smelled like ink and exhaustion. The agent in charge kept his sentences short and his expectations shorter. The warrants would go to judges who had had their breakfasts interrupted by headlines. Someone would leak. Someone always leaked. The agent signed anyway. He had no choice. If they waited, the vault would move. You can't move an island. You can move cables. You can move servers. You can move the past. At sunrise, an operations team rehearsed with divers in a lake that tasted like old leaves. The plan was part SWAT, part salvage. Secure the main island, jam signals, reach the hatch, and push through to whatever waited beneath. The code name felt like a joke none of them liked, Breathless. At sunset, on Hale's Island, a woman with pale eyes and a white shirt that never wrinkled walked along the eastern ridge where the mangroves met the rocks. Her name wasn't in any dossier because she didn't exist in public records under the name she used to sign checks. She watched the water turn from turquoise to slate. She touched the frame of her glasses and said, into no visible microphone, "We begin." Lights winked in the trees like insects. Out at sea, 2 points on the horizon slid apart and then together again, moving like a double eyelid closing. The polite man with the tan stood on a balcony and lifted a glass of water he didn't drink. He looked pleased and a little bored. In a quiet office in New York, a junior producer cued the next segment. A veteran journalist cleared her throat and said to the camera, "What we will show you tonight is the first tangible evidence that a fortune many thought imaginary may be very real, and very well protected." Somewhere in Washington, a printer jammed on page 12 of a warrant request and resumed after an impatient hit. Somewhere in Havana, a stringer with salt in his hair loaded new batteries. In a motel on the outskirts of Paris, a woman opened her freezer with burned hands and reached for a towel wrapped around a laptop and whispered to herself, "Not yet. Not yet." And in the dark water under the mangroves, a rubber seal trembled as if something inside had exhaled. Stay with me as I unveil the next episode.